You should never start a power tool against the work, say whatever it is that you happen to be cutting or grinding on. You should always start the blade and let it get to spinning to full speed before you put it into the board that you're cutting. The reason the blade cuts is because it is spinning fast. If you just put the blade against the power tool against the work, the blade against the board, and you turn it on, instead of cutting, it will actually throw the board, and frequently it gets thrown at you. I was watching a TV show several years ago, and one of the professionals had a board on a miter saw, put the blade down against the board, turned it on, and the board was thrown into her face. Luckily for her, she had safety glasses on, so instead of losing an eye, she just got stitches along her eyebrow. So make sure that you never start a power tool against the work. You should always clamp work before drilling into metal. When you're drilling into metal, especially using the drill press, right before the drill bit makes it all the way through, it frequently will grab a hold of the metal and start spinning it around. And you can't hang on to it just with your hands. You have to have it clamped because it will yank it out of your hands and it'll start spinning around and around, repeatedly hitting your hands. And trust me from experience, I know this, it hurts. So you should always make sure that you clamp your work when you're drilling into metal. Skill saws and radial arm saws are two of the absolutely most dangerous tools in a shop. I really have a dislike for radial arm saws, so I have removed the one that we used to have in our shop. I've removed it out of there, so we don't even have one anymore. Skill saws are considered one of the most dangerous because the guard that covers the blade frequently sticks open, and because of that, the saw is heavy and a lot of people will rest it against their leg, and if that guard doesn't cover the blade back up, you can have a very significant injury to your leg because of that guard not covering the blade. A saw's blade is more dangerous when it's dull. When you're dealing with a dull blade, you tend to push harder, trying to get it to cut faster. That can lead to what you're cutting binding on the blade and it kicking back at you. It could also lead to you slipping because you're pushing so hard you can slip into the blade. And so a saw's blade is always more dangerous when it's dull. If you have a dull blade, you should change it out as opposed to continuing to use it. Whenever you're unplugging a cord, say an extension cord or the cord to one of the tools, you should always grab it by the end and pull it straight out. Grabbing in the middle of the cord and yanking can cause damage to the end of the plug or the plug-in. Your hand should always be 4 to 6 inches away from a saw blade at all times, at least that far, particularly whenever you're using a miter saw or a table saw. However, when you're using a bandsaw or scroll saw, there are some exceptions when your hands will be closer than 4 to 6 inches. We will talk about those instances whenever we get to using the scroll saw and bandsaw in the shop. If a saw blade breaks, you should turn off the machine and wait until the blade quits turning and then let me know what has happened. You always wait until the blade quits turning before you leave the area. That way, if someone else happens along, you can warn them what has happened so they don't walk up to it and get injured. Make sure to keep flammable materials out of the welding area. I mean, hello, stuff that can burn in an area that has sparks. Not a good combination. So now we're going to explain why each of the following are safety hazards. Cuffs or fringes on pants can catch welding slag. I had a former student that whenever he was in class, he didn't listen to me and was welding with some frayed pants. He had these fringes on his pants. Well, needless to say, his pants caught on fire and he didn't realize it until about half of his pants leg up to the knee was burned off. Another friend of mine was welding. He's actually a former ag teacher. He was welding away, felt a warm breeze, and he quit welding, lifted up his helmet, and his shirt was halfway burned up his chest. So frayed shirts and frayed pants can catch slag and catch on fire quite easily. Long hair and loose and ragged clothing can get caught in moving parts. Once again, I had a former student. She was using a hand drill and she was drilling away, and she leaned over the top of the drill and her long hair fell around the drill and proceeded to get wrapped around the drill bit, and she finally pulled her finger off the trigger of the drill once the drill was completely wound up in her hair all the way to her head. Needless to say, there was a lot of tears shed getting that drill loose from her hair. If you have long sleeves on, you should always make sure to push them back or roll them up before you're using any of the saws. Oil or fuels on shop clothes can burn skin, and they're also a fire hazard. Dirt, sawdust, and trash are fire hazards, and they could also be tripped over. You shouldn't use gasoline to clean engine parts because it's highly combustible and it irritates the skin. I know a lot of people around here use gasoline to clean engine parts, but that doesn't mean that it's the correct thing to use. You should always use appropriate engine cleaner instead. Moving on to fire hazards. If you have a fire, you should extinguish flames by water, covering with a blanket, throwing soil on the fire, or if you're dealing with a fire in the welding area with the oxyacetylene tanks, you should shut the gas off at the tank. There are 4 classes of fires. Depending on what class of fire you have determines the proper way to extinguish the flames. Class A fires are your ordinary combustibles such as wood and paper. Class B fires are your flammable liquids, fuels, grease, oil, paints, chemicals, etc. Class C fire is electrical equipment, anytime there's a presence of an electrical current. So a house fire, while the electricity is still hooked up to it, would technically be a Class C fire. Class D fires are combustible metals, and they require a special fire extinguisher. Some of the combustible metals are magnesium and steel wool. There are several different types of fire extinguishers. There are water fire extinguishers, which can only handle Class A fires. They are normally a silver canister as opposed to the typical red fire extinguisher that you see. There's carbon dioxide fire extinguishers that handle Class B and C fires. Foam fire extinguishers that handle Class A and B. Notice a wet foam fire extinguisher should not be used on a C-class electrical fire. There are dry chemical fire extinguishers that can be used on A, B, and C-class fires. And then there's a special multi-purpose dry chemical or smothering fire extinguisher that can handle the D-class fires of combustible metals. If you have a fire, you should always call for help immediately. I do not want any of the students fighting a fire. If there is a fire, let me know and let me handle it. If the fire is very big at all, say anything other than what is on your clothes, you should evacuate the area immediately. Some fire extinguishers are activated by pulling a pin. Other fire extinguishers are activated by turning the tank upside down. And you should always make sure the fire is completely put out before you leave the area. It's very common for once the flames disappear that people think the fire's out and they'll leave, but there'll be hot coals and the fire will flare back up. So you should always make sure the fire is completely out and the coals are cool before you leave the area. This concludes our safety lesson.